Okay. It's even. Thank you all for coming here on such a beautiful spring day with a book called The Doom Loop. You have a particularly bad way of spending such a beautiful spring day, but appreciate you being here for the talk today by Professor Eswar Prasad, who is has multiple positions at Cornell, but his key position being that of the Tolani Senior Professor of Trade Policy, also a senior fellow at Brookings. Before going into the academic world, he was chief of the Financial Studies Division at the IMF in their research department. Before that, head of the China division in the IMF. Many of you have heard him speak, be interviewed on the radio, seen his many articles and op-eds published in both disciplinary journals as well as popular media. His talk today being his new book entitled The Doom Loop: While the World Economic Order is Spiraling into Disaster. Hopefully Hollywood's getting the rights to this right away, because this sounds like a dramatic story that's going to be a lot of fun. So kind of the ground rules for today is that he will make his presentation. On the way up here, he said, "How long do you want me to speak?" And it's like, you can, like an accordion, it can expand or contract as necessary. So he will speak for a time. He and I will have a short discussion. Then we'll open up into a larger Q&A. So with that, Eswar, please come on.
Thank you, Bruce. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have to start with a confession, though. This is not the book I planned to write. You come here, of course, to hear about the doom loop, but I had in mind a much cheerier book. So let me tell you a little bit about the book I planned to write and where things sort of ended up and why they ended up where they did. About 3 years ago, I started thinking a little bit about where we are in terms of the evolution of the world economic order. And certainly it seems like there is a lot going on around us. And my view was that there are some fundamental things that have shifted in terms of where the world economic order was and where it is going. So I was going to tell a story. And I spent about 4 months, much to the dismay of my academic co-authors, who would have preferred that I work on papers with them. I spent about 4 months, actually, very joyous 4 months, reading not in economics, but in history, politics, international relations, fields that I normally look at glancingly, but which I spent a lot of time spending in terms of trying to make sense of how to explain the present moment. By early 2024, I had a very clear thesis in mind, and it was a good story. And the story was the following. If you think about the 1990s, and having read in history, I was very tempted to go pretty far back in history. But my publisher strongly recommended a 400-page book rather than a 900-page book. So I decided to start in the 1990s. In the 1990s, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States became the dominant power in every respect: economic, financial, military. Now, of course, we are in a period where economic power, at least, is more evenly distributed across countries. And to an economist, and I know there are some very prominent economists in the room, instinctively one thinks about competition as being a good thing, because competition typically is good for efficiency, for balance, and for stability. Why? Because typically when you have competition, the competitors are kept disciplined to do the right thing. If you think about competition among countries, one country runs policies that run amok, that country suffers some consequences, maybe in international finance, maybe in terms of geopolitical influence, and so on. So one thinks about economic power now as being much more evenly distributed, with the emerging market economies certainly becoming as large as the advanced economies, the old industrial powers. So the story was going to be one where we're in a transition to this new balanced equilibrium, which would be a more stable world. And maybe we are on a transition path which is much more volatile. And certainly there is a lot of volatility around us. So this, to my mind, was a very compelling proposition. We're moving from a world that was stable because there was one dominant power to one where there are at least two powers, or if you think about the emerging market separately, multiple powers. That could be a different world, and the transition path is one of volatility. And the story was going to be a very pleasant one about all the forces that would take us back to this world of stability. And so I started working on the book in early 2024, thinking about all the forces that would get us back to stability. By the summer of 2024, my heart was pulling in one direction, which was the more positive direction, the book I wanted to write, but my head had pulled me in a completely different direction. And this is where the book took a dark turn, because I began to realize that all the forces that I had anticipated would lead us towards more stability were in fact going to generate more instability. So that unfortunately became the defining theme of the book. So, what is the doom loop? The notion of the doom loop is that economics, domestic politics, and geopolitics are stuck in this negative feedback loop where they're bringing out the worst in each other. So let me break that down a little bit. Let's start with globalization, which was one of the forces I had in mind as generating a better equilibrium. Once upon a time, not too long ago, globalization was seen as a positive sum game where countries, by trading with each other, could mutually benefit. So you could essentially have countries engaged in this positive sum game. And this had a couple of very important implications. Number one, you could have countries generate more productive economic relationships. They would prosper together. So they would see their interests as more closely aligned. But more importantly, this would serve as a counterbalance to the intrinsically zero-sum game of geopolitics. In geopolitics, it's hard to think about a positive sum game because intrinsically, especially when you have great power competition at work, one country gains influence, the other country has to proportionately lose influence. But in economics, you don't necessarily need to have zero-sum games. You can have positive sum games. And during the 1990s, when many emerging market economies were opening up to the world, during the 2000s, when there was much financial integration, and Professor Shambaugh, who's in the room, has written extensively about these issues. Professor J. Shambaugh, I'm sorry, I realize there are two Professor Shambaughs in this room, both very eminent in their own respects. There was a sense that this was working very well, that globalization was this positive force. So if you think about the US-China relationship, which the other esteemed Professor Shambaugh has written extensively about, there was a sense that there were things holding the relationship in a stable way. So if you think about business interests, you know, there were many businesses that viewed China as a very important market for their final products and services, as a very important part of their supply chains. So when there was a sense during the 2000s, after China had joined the World Trade Organization, that China was gaining a lot from this trade relationship with the US and with the rest of the world, but perhaps not quite playing by the rules of the game, there was a sense that there were many businesses that wanted to keep the relationship on an even keel. So they too served as a stabilizing force in this relationship. That is now gone. Now we are in a world where even globalization, free trade is seen as not a positive sum game, but a zero sum game or potentially even a negative sum game. And this has very serious implications if one thinks about the nature of geopolitics and the fact that now we don't have this balancing force. But in addition to the geopolitical element, there is a very important domestic element as well. When we think about the last 2 or 3 decades, there have been enormous gains generated by globalization, but not just globalization, but other elements like technology that have pushed productivity forward in a very positive way. the aggregate gains have been measurably large. So you talk to any economist, we will tell you that there are enormous gains from free trade. We can measure those gains, more or less. But the problem was, and I'm hardly the first to say this, we did not quite think, especially as economists, about the distributional consequences of those gains. There are many people who felt left out of these gains. Now, in a market economy, there is always churn. There are some industries that are going to do well, some that will not do so well, some firms that will prosper, some firms that will close. So the notion of people losing jobs, getting displaced because their industries or their firms don't do well, that's accepted. But what I think has really come to infect domestic politics, and I use the word infect rather than affect, because what is very important is that I think a lot of people feel they've gotten left out of opportunity. So, what does this mean? So, it means that a lot of people in these declining firms and industries not only are losing jobs, they don't have a good safety net to catch them, and they also see that the political process is being captured by the economic and political elites. And this provides a very fertile ground for certain politicians to evoke what I call the politics of resentment. Essentially, you can argue that the problems that people are facing are caused not by seemingly benign forces like technology, but by the other. And the other can be defined in different ways. It can be immigrants streaming across the southern border or perhaps even the northern border. It could be the forces of globalization. It could be the political and economic elites, those of us who teach in eminent universities like GW or my own. It could be others who are involved in the system, or it could be China. So suddenly you have a very potent force at work that argues that the real problems are caused by these extraneous vile actors. So now you have economic forces infecting domestic politics, which in turn has an effect on geopolitics, because now once you start blaming China for a variety of things, for immigrants, for fentanyl flows into the US, for a variety of other ills that face our society, it becomes a lot easier to argue that the problems festering in the society are not a function of domestic policy failures, but because of these vile external forces. So this is where the doom loop starts playing a very important role. You now have the feedback loop between economics, domestic politics, and geopolitics. So globalization is one very important element of it. But there are other forces at play. One of the forces that could potentially lead to more stability is the rules of the game. Everybody agrees upon a common set of rules that intrinsically generates stability, because there might be some people who waver from the rules, but if there is not only a set of rules that everybody has to play by, but also an enforcement mechanism, then you can restore some degree of balance. The rules of the game were largely instituted in the post-war period, with the United States playing a very important role. And these institutions, I would argue, have played a very important role in promoting domestic prosperity, international prosperity, but also international stability. This includes international institutions, of course, one dear to my heart, the International Monetary Fund down the road where I used to work for a long time, the World Bank, the United Nations, and of course, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which then became the World Trade Organization. So all of these played a very important role. That rules-based order is fraying. It's fraying because there is a sense that these institutions don't have legitimacy, and this notion of loss of legitimacy is coming from both sides. We see the United States pulling back from major institutions. I know that when Professor Shambaugh was working in government, he was working very hard to make sure, I should keep saying Professor J. Shambaugh, although David, I know again you had a role in this as well. So it was very important to see the US as being engaged in these institutions. And of course, there were certain flaws. But I think the reality is that right now we are in a period where the United States sees these institutions as not serving its interests very well, although these national interests are now very, very narrowly defined, as we all know. But at the same time, we have the emerging market economies feel that the major international institutions are not serving them well either. If you think about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, there is still this paradoxical situation that while voting rights, which again are a zero-sum game at these institutions, are supposed to be distributed according to the evolution of economic size, you still have these weird situations like the Indian economy being far larger than the Japanese economy, but having a slightly smaller voting share. If you think about all the emerging market economies put together, they don't have anywhere near the voting share that they need to have, again, because this is a zero-sum game, and there are many traditional powers that want to give up their importance in these institutions. So what has happened? What has happened is that the emerging market economies have started basically setting up their own institutions. We have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank set up by China and other emerging market economies. You have the five major emerging market economies, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, setting up the New Development Bank, which is sort of a competitor to the World Bank. Now, the interesting element about these institutions is that they get around some of the problems of the legacy institutions, such as one country, the United States, having veto power over major policy decisions because it has a 17% voting share, and major policy decisions at the IMF and World Bank require an 85% vote. In principle, the AIIB and the New Development Bank don't have these sorts of weaknesses. But we know, everybody knows that nothing can happen at these institutions without China's assent. So we have this paradox of institutions that seemingly are set up on principles that are exactly the ones that people have been trying to reform the IMF and World Bank towards for a long time. But since they're starting with a blank slate, they look great on paper. Whether on practice they're as democratic is far from clear. But the crucial point from the perspective of the theme of my book is that now the rules of the game are no longer playing a stabilizing force, because rather than cohesion, we have dissension with different institutions essentially trying to manage the rules of the game in slightly different ways. So there isn't a common set of rules of the game that everybody agrees on, with these institutions having enforcement power. So if you think about the rules of the game, they too, rather than fostering stability, have become instruments of instability. Now, there is one group of economies that could play a very important stabilizing role, and these are the middle powers. One question when you think about my notion of superpowers is, who are the superpowers? One could argue that Russia is still a superpower, but Russia really, has a lot of nukes, but has always been an economic shell. And this was true even during the period of apparent Soviet dominance during the 1980s and 1990s. So I really think we're in a world where there are two very large powers, the United States and China. And the implication of that I will come back to in a little bit. But the rest of the world is stuck in the middle. Now, there are probably Europeans amongst you, given how cosmopolitan GW's Elliott School is. My European friends are not thrilled when I talk about Europe as being a middle power. But the reality is that Europe has the potential to be a great power, but it has not coalesced. We see that Europe continues to be striven by centrifugal forces that continually threaten to pull the zone apart. So everybody is sort of stuck in the middle between these two very unsavory alternatives. The United States, which used to be seen as the paradigm that everybody aimed towards, the paradigm of liberal market-oriented democracy. And on the other hand, you have China, which is a very different vision of the world. And China would like to play a far more important role, but it's not quite there. So you probably all heard about the Trump speech at Davos, which sort of this year's Davos, which basically sucked all of the air out of the out of that meeting. So I have yet another confession to make. I couldn't resist. I was one of the throngs who stood for an hour in line to get into the Trump speech to just listen to the man in person. So I was one of the, I was there only an hour in advance. There were many who had queued up, 2 hours in advance, multi-millionaires all standing in line just to hear the man speak. I got one of the last seats in the main auditorium, and the 5 overflow rooms were also overflowing. So it was quite a spectacle. Um, I couldn't stand it for more than 45 minutes, just to state for the record. That speech got a lot of attention. There was another speech that got a lot of attention also, Mark Carney's speech. And it seemed like, so I was doing the soft launch of my book at Davos because, the book hadn't come out yet. But it was almost like Mr. Carney took the words out of my mouth and, of course, stated them much more eloquently. The notion that, number one, we are in a world of instability where instability is the norm rather than a passing phase. And second, the middle powers, everybody other than the US and China, better get used to it. And, he argued for a very pragmatic approach that essentially the middle powers are not going to agree on everything, but should just find issues that they can agree on and move forward. This is a very pragmatic, sensible approach. The middle powers include large countries, small countries, rich, poor countries. They're not going to agree on everything. So going issue by issue seems very sensible. And in fact, I talk about this in my book as issue-based alliances. India has been a master at playing this game. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, India did not participate in the sanctions on Russia because access to cheap oil is very important for India. So it allied itself with Russia and China. But India sees its fundamental values as much more closely aligned with America and the West, even when Trump occasionally, pushes India away. This actually worked very well for a while. But the problem that I argue in the book that this approach poses to India, to other middle powers, is that if you have these very transactional relationships, they may work well under specific circumstances, but these are not based on shared values, on any fundamental agreement about how the world ought to be and how it ought to function. So I don't think these are going to be very durable. So if you take India, for instance, rather than serving as a source of stability, it is now teetering from one side to other while it tries to find its place, and therefore it becomes a source of instability in itself. Now, the Carney speech and the Trump speech got a lot of attention. There was another very important speech at Davos, which fell flat. You didn't hear very much about it. This was by the Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. And this speech was very important because the Vice Premier, following up on other leaders from China who've spoken at Davos in the past, sent a very different message to the world. It said, there is this country which shall go unnamed in Premier He Lifeng's speech that is pushing everybody away, trying to thwart the rules of the game. And here we are, China, we are willing to take everybody into the world into our open and wide embrace because we have now become the defenders of multilateralism, of globalization, of free trade. That message fell flat, much to the consternation of the Chinese, because there isn't that much trust in China yet. And this is where a lot of the middle powers, especially in Asia, but also in Africa and Latin America, are stuck. On the one hand, like I said, the US is now seen as an untrustworthy and unreliable ally. On the other side, you have a country that is willing to open up its arms to other countries, but everybody else, feels that they cannot shy away from China. You had Mark Carney himself and also Premier Starmer of the United Kingdom going to China, but signing very limited deals because there is a concern that their economies, their manufacturing sectors could get swamped by a China that now is largely growing by exporting. So for much of the middle powers, it's a very unstable world. But unfortunately, their inability to coalesce or contribute to stability is actually, I think, fostering more instability. So we've talked about globalization, the rules of the game, the middle powers, all of which I thought would really help to promote stability. And again, in the cheerful version of the book, would be part of the answer, but didn't quite do so. There is one other force that is very important. We've just finished rebuilding our house. We've put in a new audio video system. We have multifunction remotes. I can't get the blasted things to work. But I'm a firm believer in technology and the promise that it has. I think technology really is the answer to many problems. And if you think about increasing resources, and if you think in as a corollary about the lack of resources or the paucity of resources being the source of most conflict, it should reduce conflict. In my book, I talk about three specific technologies: AI, digital currencies, and social media. All of these have the power not only to generate productivity and prosperity, but also to bring us closer together in principle. If you think about digital currencies, you don't even need fancy cryptocurrencies. If you think about digital payments, these have been absolutely transformative in many countries, low income, middle income, and so on. You go to China, and as you go to India these days, you can get easy access to digital payments. You don't need to have access to a bank account or credit card. So financial access through digital payments has really transformed people's lives. But it's not just digital payments. These have become portals for people to get basic banking services, to manage credit, savings, risk. And this makes people feel that they have a vested interest in their countries prospering because they feel that they can now share in that prosperity. These have been remarkable forces. All of us in this room, I'm sure, are now using AI to some extent or the other. As a professor, I worry. As a student, you're probably delighted if you have your assignment to hand in at 9 o'clock in the morning. At 8:45, you have your assignment done. And you can probably fool us pretty easily, although we professors like to think that we can smell out, work not done by you. We really can't. Each of these, I think, has enormous potential, but I worry. I worry about these technologies because for all the positive aspects, the reality is that they are increasing the concentration of economic and financial power. If you think about digital currencies, for instance, yes, we now have stable coins that are backed up by dollars by and large, because everybody in the world still wants dollars. If you think about other types of cryptocurrencies, they're enabling more efficient payments, especially cross-border payments, which are very important for exporters, importers, economic migrants sending remittances to their home countries. Right now, international payments are a mess. They're very expensive. They take a lot of time to undertake these transactions. They're very costly. What cryptocurrencies have shown us is all these technologies, all of these problems can be gotten around by using technologies. So are cryptocurrencies the right answer to the question of how do we improve domestic and international payments? Not necessarily. But I think they're really serving as a catalyst to many of these improvements. But one can well imagine a world now where digital currencies of various sorts, including stable coins, which maintain stable value because they are backed up by stores of fiat currencies like the US dollar. Those can be used for international payments, and one can well see currencies of countries that do not have credible central banks, that have high levels of inflation, essentially being swept aside by easy access to stable coins, which could soon be easily available worldwide. So you could actually have a lot of currencies face existential threats. Even the Eurozone right now does not have a unified payment system. So they are moving forward with the digital version of the euro, the digital euro, which is likely to come on board in 2027 or 2028. Why? Because they are equally concerned about being swamped by dollar-based payment mechanisms. So I think there is a real concern that such technologies could lead to more concentration, and we see the same thing with AI, of course. At this meeting in Davos, I met a lot of African entrepreneurs who are absolutely, gushing about the prospects that AI had of allowing them to compete with the big boys from the industrial countries, whether they were in manufacturing or services. When the talk turned to employment, however, it was a completely different story. Because there was a sense that while these new technologies might actually be very helpful in terms of increasing productivity, in terms of improving competitiveness, in terms of employment generation, which is already a problem in many of these economies, I think there is a real concern. So when I think about technology again, I think it has the potential to create a vast amount of new resources. But just like with the inequality created by globalization, I worry equally that especially if we don't have guardrails on these technologies, they could lead to much more concentration of economic and financial wealth and power. And of course, if you take the combination of technologies like AI and social media, these give disruptive actors, either domestically or nations like North Korea, the ability to foment a lot more destruction. So the notion of technology generating instability is not quite there. At this point in the evolution of my book, I was a little concerned because, as I said, my heart had wanted to go in one direction, my head had pulled me in a completely different direction. I was not completely willing to let go of my original thesis, however. So I wanted to resurrect it, and I started thinking a little bit again, limiting myself to relatively recent history. This is not the first time we've had, shifts in global economic power or seeming shifts. I spoke about the 1990s, about the US becoming the dominant power in every respect with the fall of the Soviet Union. But then Japan began to rise as a rival to the US, and then it sort of faded away. In the 2000s, it looked like Europe might rise as a rival to the US, and then it's kind of fading away. There is one very important difference relative to the present competition, which is that if you think about Europe, Japan, the United States, the fundamental values about how you organize a political, economic, legal, social system, all of these countries basically saw eye to eye. So it was just an economic rivalry. But now we have a rivalry where I think it's really about the vision of the world. What is the type of society? What is the type of economy? What is the type of legal system that you want to become pervasive? Why does this matter? When one thinks about great power competition, one can argue that there have been many instances in history where the only way this has resolved itself is through military conflict. I actually don't think that cataclysmic outcome is the most likely scenario. Yes, Trump talks about wanting, Greenland, and of course, and Davos sometimes instead of Greenland, he started saying Iceland, which got a lot of people in the room very worried. Who knows what else he wants? China does want, parts of Asia around the Spratly Islands and so on, and perhaps Taiwan will bring things to a head, but who knows? But fundamentally, it's not like the U.S. wants China's territory or China wants the U.S. territory. But I think this clash about the visions of the world is really important for one critical reason. Countries that have similar forms of organization tend to stick together. Yes, the United States is now pushing away some of its very close allies, but typically the US, Europe, Japan have stuck together because they view the world in exactly the same way. If you think about the autocracies of the world, they tend to stick together because they view the world in the same way. So I think this is where we have come to a point right now where if you think about a resolution to this great power conflict that ends up somewhere in the middle, it's going to be very difficult because there is no middle. I think these two powers have very, very different visions about how to organize the world, which is why I think that the notion of the doom loop and this notion of instability being the norm for a while is really where we are going to be. Now, having told you all these dark things, I have to provide a way out. I can tell you what the way out was going to be in the cheerful version of the book, and even in the darker version, I think that is the answer. It's really about institutions. I spoke about international institutions, but domestic institutions are equally important as well. And what are the domestic institutions that are important? It includes the rule of law, an institutionalized system of checks and balances, a free and fearless press that holds public officials to account. And it includes, even specific institutions like the central bank that need much more independence in order to operate effectively and with a degree of credibility. All of these institutions are, of course, under severe pressure. The international institutions, as I already argued, are under severe pressure as well. I think ultimately this is where the answer lies. Now, one could think about this, depending upon your political predilections, as either a shining moment or a dark moment in U.S. Political evolution. But the reality is that the U.S. has gone from one side of the political spectrum to the other. But of course, the US is very special, so you don't just go from one side to the other, you lurch from one side to the other and back. But there is a very important dynamic that is relevant for this lurching or shifting from side to side, which is the corrective mechanisms. And the corrective mechanisms, in addition to the specific institutional elements that I spoke about, include the democratic process working very well. I think we have a great deal of reason to be worried about whether these elements of the corrective mechanism are going to work well, either domestically or on the international front. So I think we are at a very fraught moment in the evolution of the international order. And while I think we would like to comfort ourselves that this may be an aberration, certainly humanity has been through very volatile periods. I think this dynamics of the doom loop are going to be very difficult to get out of in the foreseeable future. If you ask me how long do I mean by the foreseeable future, I will refuse to be pinned down, but it's not going to be anytime soon. And to get out of it is really going to take a lot of work. It's not that we can't get out of it, but it's going to take two critical ingredients. One is, for us to become more engaged as citizens not just of our countries, thinking about our narrow short-term interests, but as citizens of our communities and of the broader international community, to recognize that it's really only shared prosperity that will work well for all of us. We also need leaders, community leaders, business leaders, and of course, national leaders who will enable us to look past our short-term prejudices and fears and, inspire us by thinking about a better future. We don't have that now. And in fact, when I think about the book, the other thing I forgot to mention is that I had actually finished the full first draft of the book in October of 2024. In the last couple of weeks of October 2024, I read through the whole manuscript and said, damn, this is too dark. Let's just wait for a couple of weeks. We're going to have elections here. Things are going to sort of settle down. And maybe, I should give my heart another chance and rethink the thesis of the book, or at least tone it down a bit. Of course, unfortunately for the world, fortunately for the book, everything that has happened in the last 15, 16 months has validated, if not turbocharged, the thesis of the book. But I think it's really a very difficult moment. And I view the contribution of the book as not really about solutions. We need to think very hard about solutions. But what is important is understanding the dynamics, the forces, the interactions between the forces that got us here. And I think it's worth thinking about this combination. Now, it's not that economics, domestic politics, and geopolitics have always, been moving on different tracks. They've always moved in parallel tracks and intersect with each other. But we are at a moment right now where this intersection, the intertwining of these forces is very, very difficult to separate. So what it's going to take to get out of the doom loop is really a lot of very hard work, a lot of institution rebuilding, a lot of institution creation. And ultimately, it's going to be a tough path out, but it's incumbent on every one of us to do our bit. Thank you.
Let's start by I should start by introducing myself. So if you're wondering why I get to introduce the speaker and take up your time from Q&A at the beginning here, I'm Bruce Dixon. I'm director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. We're the co-sponsors of today's event, and we're lucky to co-sponsor the event with the Institute for International Economic Policy, also part of the Elliott School here. So I want to begin with first a question of a counterfactual. So you talk about the trends that that took us from this virtuous circle to a doom loop. If Donald Trump had not been president in the US, if Xi Jinping had not been president in China, would that doom loop still have emerged, or was it more specific to these individuals?
Personalities, Bruce, are very important in history. And of course, personalities can drive policies as well. As I mentioned, however, this book was completed by October of 2024, and I could see these forces playing out not just in the United States, not just as a result of Trump. I view him as basically taking advantage of many of these forces. But this is not, again, a book about the US. It's not a book about Trump. It's not a book about the specific moment we are in right now. But you see these forces playing out around the world, including in my country of origin, India, where things have certainly taken a somewhat dark turn. If you look around Europe, there are many countries in Europe where these very same dynamics have been played for a while right now. And I think it's worth thinking about what changed, because I argued, and this speaks to your point about the counterfactual, that in the 1990s, the 2000s, things seemed to be working very well, that everybody had faith that globalization was going to work well. And it seemed like the paradigm of liberal, market-oriented democracy was what the entire world saw as the paradigm that it should work towards. And then it started falling apart. And I think it speaks to the intrinsic fragility of democracy. First of all, the recognition that it's institutions that are important, but norms are equally important, and they've proven to be much more fragile than anticipated. And second, the fact that you had the combination of market economies and democracies being very vulnerable to political capture was something we had not fully recognized or internalized. I suspect in your fields, you were far ahead of us, economists at least. We like to think that we have it all figured out. But I think you, as I've been reading recently, have a lot of things figured out much more clearly than we had. So that was the other important element. But I think the element that my book brings to the foreground is that the globalization actually turbocharged all of this negative feedback loop. So there are people who've very clearly told the stories about political capture, about how globalization and the distributional consequences thereof are not paid enough attention to. So we've had the connection between domestic economics and globalization, between geopolitics and politics. But these three, I think, need to be viewed together as creating this negative feedback loop where they're bringing out the worst in each other. So to address your question more directly, if there had not been a Donald Trump, if there had not been a Xi Jinping, would these things not have taken place at all? Maybe my book would have been ahead of its time by a few years, but I think these forces were already in play.
You mentioned India being your country of origin. At least here in Washington, India does not get a lot of attention as being a potential threat to the U.S. or to the international order. China wasn't necessarily seen as a threat a generation ago, but things change as you mentioned. Where is India going to fit into this doom loop?
My hope had been that India would be one of the answers to how do we get out of the doom loop. But it is stuck in a very difficult position. Now, India, of course, has a long history of participation in what used to be called the non-aligned movement, when the US and the then USSR were sort of the two superpowers. India didn't want to align itself too closely with any of them, and it's stuck in a similar position right now, where it has this economic and geopolitical giant on its borders, and as you know, there have been some border tensions between the two countries. India would like to be much closer to the US, and it's not seen as a threat to the US, largely because it's not a huge economy yet. It is going to be the fifth, possibly soon the fourth largest economy, but the gap, not just in per capita incomes, but in absolute size between the US and India is so large that I don't think it is seen as a major economic rival. I had hoped, again, that India would take more of a leadership role in terms of trying to bring the middle powers together. And India's grand hope, of course, had been that it could benefit from these geopolitical realignments. Now, when I speak about globalization, you know, there is a sense that perhaps there is a retreat from globalization, but it's not quite happening. If you look at the overall volumes of trade, in fact, they're expanding right now. But there is a very important qualitative difference. While you used to have trade being seen as a bridge between geopolitical rifts, now trade and financial flows are falling along geopolitical lines. So they're deepening those rifts. And India had hoped to benefit from this geopolitical realignment. Um, and it looked like India, with many of the reforms it has put in place in recent years, could play an important role as an alternative supply chain hub as the US is trying to withdraw from China. But the reality is that India doesn't quite have the scale, and India's attempt to move into higher value added, higher tech manufacturing is hitting some pretty significant constraints right now because India still remains reliant on foreign technology. And like every other country in the world, India is terrified of being swamped by Chinese manufacturing. So it's in a very defensive position right now rather than playing a leadership role.
Before we open up, I got one last question. I want to push you on your happy ending that you finished your talk on. In your intro, you say that we need to rely on our better natures to build institutions. How confident are you that our better natures will actually prevail?
Yeah. There is the hope and there is the reality. It's a little difficult to see a clear path out. As I mentioned, there are corrective mechanisms that have usually pulled things, especially in democracies, back into an equilibrium. If you think about how autocracies function, things tend to get more and more rigid. And I think this is the direction in which China is heading right now. And more rigidity typically implies more brittleness. So typically you have transitions taking place that are somewhat, explosive or revolutionary in nature. In democracies, you have much easier pathways to adjustment. But those pathways, I think, are becoming really blocked right now. So it will take a huge level of engagement. I mean, there are many of us in this room who I suspect are taking comfort in the notion that come November, the checks and balances will work and we'll be back to some semblance of at least semi-normality. But I think we can't take any of this for granted anymore. So I worry. A more positive spin, again, is one could argue that, the existing international institutions in particular are not working very well. So one can get mired in despondency that, we cannot really fix them. But maybe this is also a good time for us to be thinking about what a new set of institutions might look like that embody principles. And this is why in my book, rather than saying, exactly what the voting structure ought to be, I talk about basic principles like fairness, transparency, the ability to evolve as the underlying structure of economic and political systems evolve. And these are not very easy to codify. Again, I know in your discipline, with some help from my discipline, there's been a lot of work trying to think about optimal voting structures, and there is no clear answer. It depends on what the objective function is, so on. So maybe we should think about this as a time where we do some blue sky thinking about what happens if the doom loop were to end in a very uh, in a very destructive fashion. So we have to fashion a new set of institutions from the embers of all that lay behind. Smooth transition is certainly something that one hopes for, but like I said, I'm getting a little worried about whether we will get to that stage.
So he's given us a lot to think about in this very short presentation. So we have for Q&A. Don't do what I did, which was simply just start talking without introducing yourself. So first, tell us who you are and then make your question short and hopefully one question, not four or five bundled together. And I'll let you pick the.
Thank you very much for the talk. Stephen Kaplan, a professor here at GW in International Political Economy. Doom Loop, right? The title Doom Loop is a great science fiction title, right? If you were to have a time machine, right, you just ended up talking about where international institutions can go. You mentioned fairness, transparency, things that historically, right, our international governance structure did embody. Counterfactually, once again, if you were at a point, say the early 2000s, and thinking about what could have been done from an institutional governance structure to avoid the doom loop setting in, are there reforms or things that would have put the international governance system in a better position?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Could we have done things differently? And the answer is both domestically and on the international front, there are many things that, looking back, we could have done differently. In the United States, for instance, and in many liberal democracies, I think the capture of the political system was really a problem. Now, is there a way that could have been avoided? One possibility is that if we had thought of better adjustment mechanisms so that when these forces of technology, of globalization hit our economies, that people didn't feel excluded, not just from jobs, but from the opportunity to clamber back on the economic ladder. That may have helped a lot. On the international institution front, certainly if we had these institutions evolving in a way that they maintained greater legitimacy and also were more effective at enforcing the rules of the game, that would certainly have helped. The notion, for instance, that China took advantage of the rules of the game, it may have been overstated, but there is certainly some element of truth to it. I spoke about American businesses viewing China as a great opportunity. Those businesses have by and large been disillusioned. It's still a large market. It's still a large opportunity. But the sense that, China is never going to play by the rules of the game or provide a fair or level playing field for foreign businesses has certainly affected the way things are involved. So yes, some things could have been done a little differently if we thought about the domestic and international dynamics. But how do we prevent political capture? That's a really difficult question, whether one can put mechanisms in place. As I alluded to briefly, we need to think very hard about norms as well, because, you can't write down rules of the game for everything. And I think to me and perhaps to others in this room, the fragility of norms has been a bit of a surprise. Okay. Maybe I'll start with the student.
Here. Okay. Hello, I'm John. I'm an Asian Studies student here at the Elliott School. First, wanted to thank you for your talk. I really learned a lot, and that is why I have a question for you. So you mentioned Europe in your talk a few times as like a single entity alongside the United States. And I wondered your thoughts on, like, given the current instability in the world, what are the odds of Europe being pushed together in its political and economic goals? And what might that look like? So you mentioned like the digital currency or the digitization of the euro, stuff like that.
Okay, so your question is basically, is there hope for Europe? So John, it's a good question. So like I said, we have seen the grand European project not quite deliver on its promise. What is encouraging is that in the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen Europe, come together and stand up. It comes together and stands up when there is a collective threat, in particular to its territorial integrity. Then Europe, does doesn't jump to the moment, but does sort of slowly rise to the moment. But in a more proactive sense, if you think about what is needed to make Europe a true economic and geopolitical power, on the economic front, we have had in the Eurozone in particular, banking union, but financial markets still remain very fragmented. If you look at the cohesion of other policies, including fiscal policies or regulatory policies, there hasn't been either progress or there is lack of nimbleness on many of those issues. So it's become a bureaucracy that is holding I think, Europe back from some of its potential, because it's still, I think, a region, and I'm dangerously close to sounding patronizing here, but it is a region that has phenomenal potential, phenomenal riches. But that potential is going to be difficult to accomplish under its present governance structures. The digital currency project is, again, one example. When I wrote my previous book on the future of money, I used to think that retail central bank digital currencies were a good idea, to broaden financial inclusion, to provide resiliency to payment systems. My view has shifted about whether those are really needed. In countries like China, India, we see digital payments working perfectly well without, central bank digital currency. Europe is the one place that I think actually needs a central bank digital currency. This is because their payment systems are fragmented. So this is a problem that they've not been able to solve, 27 years after the creation of the Eurozone. So it shows that Europe can act when it wants to, but it takes a lot of time to act. And this is not a world in which there is that much time to act. So I worry about Europe. And if you look at the political dynamics in many countries in Europe, which again affects the broader European project, it's not going in a very positive direction. We didn't spend that much time talking about, the poorer economy. So allow me a brief discussion of those. We've talked about the advanced economies, the emerging market economies, but the group of countries that I really worry about are the low-income economies that are just beginning to emerge onto the world stage. These are countries, including many in Africa, that have phenomenal potential, extensive natural resources, populations that are not that gray yet, young, growing labor forces, and they're coming into a world where you have one large power basically putting tariffs on imports coming into it. You have the other large power basically growing by exporting. Last year, China had a $1.2 trillion goods surplus. So they're sort of coming into this world. Trade barriers are going up around the world. There is a lot of instability coming from the lack of cohesion among the major powers and the breakdown of the rules-based order. So this creates even more problems, and compounded by technological changes that are making it difficult to generate good employment growth in these economies. So I think these countries are really cauldrons of potential social instability, making things that are already bad even worse. And the reason I bring that up in the context of the Europe question is that these pressures will spill over into the rest of the world. The desperation caused by weak economic outcomes are very difficult to keep bottled up in these countries. And I think the politics in Europe have been very badly affected by the immigrant flows that were experienced for a while. And, we've seen immigrant flows affect politics in this country as well. So I think this will affect very negatively, not just the countries that are at the receiving end of these difficulties, but the world more broadly. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. Okay, thank you, Professor Prasad. Excellent presentation. If you look at the Forbes magazine list of the top 10 wealthiest individuals 20 years ago, they were primarily involved in manufacturing or energy. If you look 10 years ago, they were primarily involved in services with some manufacturing, banking, finance mixed in. Now, if you look, 9 out of 10 are involved in information technology and services, and in many cases, social media and other media platforms. And we're seeing in Hungary, Turkey, United States, El Salvador, many places, they're using that as a springboard for political power to fight any form of regulation on their sources of wealth, and also to make the markets less open and competitive. This is not an AI question, I promise, but do you see this trend continuing where the people that control the flow of information rather than the resources or the technology are going to be the ones that dominate the next generation?
I don't fear AI questions if you wanted to take it in that direction. The issue is really, I think, one of scalability. And what we have seen is that many of these technologies are very easily scalable, and the network effects, contribute to that scalability. So That I think is what is leading to outsized returns in these industries. If you think about manufacturing or traditional financial services, they do have some degree of scalability, but the level and pace of scalability in some of these new technology industries is going to be very, very difficult to match if you're making real things or even if you're making financial services. So I think it is so that is the prism I would see it by. When you can think about a technology that can scale up where the network effects are so large, that's going to be the industry. And right now that seems to be information technology.
So I'm Michael Moore. I'm an international trade economist here at GW. So I want to push back a little bit on this idea that we've had this long-standing economic order. I would say since colonial powers fought over resources in the developing world up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's much more often to have a very small group of countries that were using this international rules after that the U.S. had after World War II. That's actually the exception, not the rule. So that's, in a sense, an optimistic view of things, that perhaps we're having a more typical situation coming forward. But the question really is about the way economists talked about globalization in those heady days of the 1990s and the 2000s. We always have said that you have overall gains, and you've alluded to this indirectly, but good trade economists also talked about Stoked Samuelson, the permanent loss of income of certain groups that we often glossed over to the detriment of the position of those favoring economic globalization. Do you think economists played an important role in overselling the benefits of globalization when we actually knew better?
Yeah, that's a fair indictment of many of us. I don't think we oversold the benefits, but we didn't fully appreciate the downsides. And like I said, it was this sense of unfairness that I think is really important. It's not that people are losing jobs, but they feel that they have no opportunity to clamber back. And I think that sense, not just of more uncertainty, of more volatility, but the lack of any path back up is really the problem. So we need to think certainly about better mechanisms. It's not easy to think about alternative mechanisms because you don't. It's easy to talk about retraining workers, but to take a 40-50-year-old worker from Detroit who's very good, skilled at what he or she does, but cannot easily transfer those skills to another job is tricky. Or asking somebody who's now 50 or 60 to learn programming skills, especially at a time where programming now may be overtaken by AI and other technologies. It's hard, but I think this infection of domestic politics really is the key to all of this, a sense that the system is stacked against people who lose out in multiple ways. You lose jobs, you lose opportunity, and then you see even policies, regulatory policies, tax policies being shifted in a way that even more favors those who've already benefited from globalization. So that lack of fairness, I think, is one of the critical issues here. And that leaves, people very vulnerable to the siren calls of politicians who say that this is all the fault of others. But you're right. We should be paying more attention to these distributional consequences. And since we economists like to think of ourselves as very clever, maybe we should find politically acceptable solutions to thinking about redistribution that can serve as a transition to wherever the new economy is headed. And that's not easy in this climate. I'm going to take a student question and then come back to you if you don't mind. Yes.
Hello. Oh, hi, I'm Asma. I'm a junior. I'm double majoring in IA and economics. So I kind of have like a loaded question. There's kind of a few parts to it. So you mentioned the different groups of the middlemen and global superpowers. I wanted to ask you from your perspective, and obviously it's a case by case basis. where do consumers, elites, or business sectors come into play, and who are the winners and losers of this doom loop? And especially with evolving factors of instability, will there be a turning point, and when and how could that happen? And you mentioned that domestic politics is the key to this. So is it possible that if one country, if they have internal reform, that could cause a trickle effect to other nations? Or will it have to be a collective group effort? I just want to see a perspective of how reforms could be possible.
Okay, Asma, there is a lot in that question. You must be a great student to have in whichever classes you take, because you clearly think very broadly and asked exactly the right questions. Yeah, none of these questions have very easy answers to them. And let me redirect your question in a different way. So, now that I talk about the doom loop, certainly things have changed since the Iran war started. But before the Iran war started, um, on the surface, things looked very good. 2025 was not a terrible year for the world economy. It grew by about 3.5%, and 2026 looked like it might be a pretty decent year for the world economy as well. Financial markets were doing pretty good. And, we think about it, major source of instability has broken out. But if you think about, say, the S&P index, yes, it has fallen, but it's fallen by 4% after going up a lot last year. So where is the doom loop? And the answer is that the doom loop is perfectly consistent with things looking very good on the surface, but tensions building up underneath the surface. So you asked about the winners and losers. If you think about the period in the early 2000s, that was a period that was called the Great Moderation. And it was called the period of the Great Moderation because the world economy was doing very well. The US economy, emerging market economy is doing pretty well. Inflation was under control. Financial markets were doing well. And then it turned out that we had the crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008, because a lot of financial market imbalances are building up underneath. Now I think there are lots of stresses building up underneath the very right now the surface is not that placid anymore, but underneath the surface, real tensions are building up. And I think these are tensions not just economic or financial, but ones that are really tearing apart the social fabric in many countries. So it could have much longer lasting effects. The last part of your question was, the more positive spin. What if we have one country that shows us a way out? That would be great. I mean, right now, each country, if you look at all the major powers, Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, maybe Canada is going to be the shining light that takes us out. But the reality is that in each country, I think these forces have become more potent, the forces of the doom loop, that the fraying of institutions is going to make it much harder to put things back. So I don't think it is an impossible task. I think it's going to be a very difficult task. And yes, when certain countries can find domestic stability, that is certainly going to help. And, if you think going back to Europe, there were many countries that did seem to have the right sort of stability. They had better economic systems. They had better redistributive mechanisms. Even those societies, take Nordic countries like Sweden, have come under a lot of pressure because of external factors like immigration. Even in a country like Switzerland, where things are going perfectly well in every respect. Yes, the Swiss franc is much too strong. It's hurting the country's exports. But even there, you see the very conservative anti-immigrant parties beginning to take a hold because this narrative has become powerful even in a country that doesn't have too many immigrants, which is doing by most accounts quite well. So there is, I hope, a way out, but it's not easy to see for the haze. Yes, sir, you've been patient. Yes.
Yeah. So my name is Anandalingam. I was going to say, as a partly a joke, that I was on my way to becoming dean of the Johnson School, and a doom loop got me in. So I just get there. I just want, you said in the beginning of your talk that you read a lot of history and read a lot of political science and various things. So the thing is that a lot of your talk is about the more recent decades. And when you use the word the world economic order, a lot of it was essentially based with the US being the leader of rules of the game kind of thing. So I'm wondering, appealing to your economics thing, perhaps what's really going on, and I want you to speculate on this, that you're going from one equilibrium to perhaps a different equilibrium. And in the transition is where you're seeing all this disorder. And perhaps in the long run, it's going to look like the very several centuries ago, where China was the dominant economy. And perhaps we are on our way to a new equilibrium where you are not going to find these dooms and loops, but with a different country coming up with the new world economic order, and then maintaining stability at that point. So I do wonder whether we are in a transition from an old world order with all these stable institutions and rules of the game. And that what's really happening is this a lot of spiraling, but we're actually heading to a different equilibrium.
As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that was my animating hypothesis for the more cheerful version of my book, that we're just in a volatile transition path. I don't think that is the answer anymore. I think, for the reasons I laid out, that all these forces that should lead us to a more stable, better equilibrium are in fact leading us down to a path where instability becomes the norm. But your question also brings, sorry?
It's about China being the
Yeah, so there is an interesting element about history. Like I said, I made a strategic choice to stick to recent history, although I would dearly have loved to go much further back in time. One issue about the framing device that I spoke to you about initially is something that is not necessarily accepted by political scientists. So I had a book workshop at Cornell where I decided it'd be fun not to have any economists, but to bring in people from all the disciplines that I spoke about. And the very basic thesis that I laid out, that, you know, a world with more competition should be a more stable one, was challenged right off the bat. Because yes, if you go back in history, it turns out that periods when you had a hegemon, they've never been entirely benevolent, but by and large, if they've been good hegemons, that can be a period of greater stability than when you have great power competition. So if you think about your world where, you know, China becomes the dominant power, the question is, do we want to be in that world where the sort of institutions that China, you know, champions are the sort of institutions we would want to live under? Would that generate more stability? So when we think about the 1990s and 2000s, you know, there was this notion of end of history and so on, because we thought we had arrived at the answer. So really, the reason I ended up focusing on my book, in addition to the fact that I didn't want it to become, my publisher didn't want it to be a 700-page book, was because it seemed like we were so close to fixing everything, that we had the answers, we had a very clear paradigm that seemed to have won, that was generating prosperity all the way around, and then things fell apart. So the question is, what do we do to bring that back? We could go to a different equilibrium where you have China being the dominant power, but I worry that that is not going to be a stable equilibrium either, because, you know, if you think about the system that doesn't have corrective mechanisms, that's going to be inherently unstable. So when I spoke about the visions of the world and why, you know, there is no easy place to meet in the middle, we are in a world right now where we have, you know, rather than competition leading to a better outcome, we are having essentially a race to the bottom, where we see, you know, one set of um, ideas about how to organize political, legal, and economic systems, you know, out there, and the other system, what we have here, you know, falling towards that. You know, in many ways, you know, we are seeing things here that you would see normally in China. attacks on the judiciary, attacks on the press, the checks and balances not working, a unitarian power playing a very big role. Data don't please the person at the top, so the providers of the data get attacked. I had a piece in the FT actually how the Chinese may be winning the geopolitical game by default because we have forces here that are making the US look more like China. So that could be an equilibrium where the US and China look similar. I think it would be a very sad and terrible equilibrium and not a stable one. Please.
My name is Michelle Mubaru. I am a master's student in the IEP program. And I think it's funny that you mentioned the book workshop because I was the note taker
Yes.
for that workshop. And I think it's really funny that at the time I wasn't too aware of what was going on and I didn't really know what was, how transformational what we were talking about was. I knew that your previous book, The Future of Money, was a great seller and everybody considered it very fundamental to financial economics, which is what I'm now trying to do. And one of the things that's pivotal to that book and what your talk right now was digital currency as maybe a solution to at least some of the problems that are in the book. And my question is on the systemic risk that comes with stablecoin being attached to the dollar. And I'm curious as to, I mean, given that I did economics in undergrad and I'm doing economics now, every class you go to, you learn about the 2008 financial crisis and the systemic risk and how crazy it was. But for me and how I'm looking at it, it seems that attaching the digital currencies and the stable coin to the dollar is just diversifying the opportunity for that to happen again. And I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
So Ms. Miguero is actually very important for the evolution of the book because she was at that book workshop at Cornell referred to. She took very detailed notes, which were very helpful. So finally, you get to see the product that came out of all those discussions. So stable coins, are cryptocurrencies, but unlike Bitcoin, which is very unstable value because its value is not anchored by anything, stable coins have stable value because they're backed up one-to-one by reserves of fiat currencies like the US dollar. And it turns out in the stable coin world, there are stable coins backed up by euro assets, by yen assets, and so on. But the only stable coins that the world seems to want are dollar-backed stable coins. So there is a whole different story here about how stable coins may end up actually increasing the dollar's dominance as a payment currency and perhaps indirectly as a reserve currency as well. The question you asked was about whether this could lead to financial instability or other forms of instability. As I mentioned, there is a significant risk for many currencies out there that they get swarmed by dollar-denominated stable coins simply because it is more trusted than the currencies of many countries. So there is that fragmentation of the international monetary system. Also, it means that the US, has, in a sense, more power to sow chaos in the world because if the dollar through this backdoor way becomes much more important in global finance, it means that US economic policies, US monetary policies in particular, have larger spillover effects onto the rest of the world. Now, as you may have probably heard, the rest of the world is desperate to diversify away from, to de-risk from the dollar. The reality is that even though central banks are buying gold, even though China and Russia talk about, trading in their own currencies, the reality is that it is currencies like the euro, the Japanese yen, the pound sterling that have taken something of a beating. And the dollar, although there are very good reasons why the dollar should be knocked off its pedestal, it's not quite happening. So even in the last, 13, 14 months since Trump took office, there's been the notion that people are, concerned about buying US treasuries, foreign investors, that is. The reality is that, foreign investors have bought an additional, $700 billion worth of US treasuries over the last 12 months because there is no other place to turn for really safe and liquid investment. So this could potentially mean that the disciplining mechanism is failing, which means that the US can continue with its policies with lack of fiscal restraint and with US monetary policies potentially having very significant effects on the rest of the world. So you ask about financial instability, there is a potential for financial instability in the US because of potential redemption runs on stable coins, but that's a slightly more nuanced story. But for the rest of the world, this is certainly a real concern. As an author of a book, I could keep talking till the cows come home. And I know these are interesting topics, but I know all of you have lives to lead. So I'll just take any remaining questions collectively, and then I will provide one summary answer to all questions, please.
Very interesting talk. Thanks. I'm Janet Steele, School of Media and Public Affairs. I'm interested, you mentioned the non-aligned movement, and then you talked about all of these world's really poor countries. Why do you think that was possible in the 55 in Bandung and then 61 in Belgrade? Is this impossible now? Was it just these charismatic leaders like Sukarno and Nasser and Nehru? And should we just write off the bottom 50% of the world, or what do you think about that?
Any other questions, please?
It's a quick implication question. I noticed you were skeptical of China-led global order. I wonder if you could talk about China via the doom loop, right? Here we have a country that values job, regime stability, yet the treatment here is that economic interdependence is much more unstable than we thought. What does this mean for China, right? Should China be integrating as much as it is? Because there's a paradox, right? For a country that wants to have as much stability as possible, the doom loop represents, and economic interdependence represents instability, right? Which I see as sort of the central thesis of the book. So what does that mean specifically for China? Not necessarily as a leader, but in terms of balancing those tensions, right? Between stability at home and potential increasing instability globally.
One more. Back to the issues you had with like political capture, economic capture, everything like that. But yet you say there's solutions to all this. What do you think is this issue as a reformed like neoliberal order free market, or is this just the natural progression of it with capital accumulation?
Okay. So, Janet, the non-aligned movement was successful in showing a common front, but my reading of history is that it wasn't particularly effective. Yes, it was a group of countries that did its best to stay out of the clutches of either of the two great powers, and it seemed like a natural solution to the fact that at the time it wasn't obvious which system would triumph. But if you think about whether these countries collectively had an impact in terms of world economic policies or world geopolitics, it's not completely obvious because India, for all its non-alignment, did get somewhat pulled into the orbit of the Soviet Union, I think to its detriment in terms of economic policy in particular. And I think we are at a similar moment right now. If you think about the middle powers, it's a very motley group right now. And they're the ones most affected by certain issues like climate change and so on. But are they able to drive the agenda in a clear way? Again, within that group, there are so many differences in view that I don't see that working very effectively. So the final two questions are kind of related, like what should countries be aiming towards? Is the Chinese system likely to persevere? I think the concern for China right now is that the system is not delivering very well in terms of social stability. And that again comes not just from economic prosperity, but also things like employment growth. I mean, even during the last 3 decades when China has generated phenomenal GDP growth, employment growth has been relatively limited. And one might again argue that for a country with a shrinking labor force, maybe this is not such a big deal. But I think the sense that that system too is subject to some degree of capture and is becoming increasingly rigid, I think is very worrying for China. And for China right now, the big challenge is how to get out of its dependence on the rest of the world. I mean, it's not a tenable situation for the second largest economy in the world to have to rely on the rest of the world in order to absorb a huge amount of its excess supply. So China wants to lead, but I think the nature of its institutional mechanisms makes it very difficult for countries to really trust it. I mean, here we are losing trust of the rest of the world as well. But intrinsically, I think for China, this is a bit of a problem. This is why, like I mentioned, when China opens its arms wide in an embrace, countries are not shying away from it, but are not willing to go fully into it either. But that leaves open this big question on the table, like what is the right paradigm right now? Going back to my earlier answer, we thought we had a very clear answer. It seemed to be working for a while, but I think we are coming to recognize right now this combination of free markets and liberal democracy is not quite the panacea we had thought, and especially when you add in the forces of globalization. And this is where the dynamics of the doom loop become important. It's turning out to be much more fragile, so I don't see an easy way out. Again, my answer might seem a little facile when I keep invoking institutions, but I think to have institutions working well is really the only way we can have the corrective mechanisms that help us get out of this. So on that not so uplifting note, maybe.
I want to thank all of you for staying so long in such a beautiful day. It's because your back is to the window, so you don't quite see how lovely it is outside. But please join me in thanking Professor Prasad for his presentation.